On behalf of Festival Directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple and our colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome you all back to this second session of The Brave New World. For those of you who weren't able to log on to the Corona Chronicles with Sid Mukherjee and Peter Frankopan, please watch this on Facebook page JLF Litfest or on our YouTube channel JPR Litfest. I know there are bandwidth issues and everybody's been having problems sort of buffering, but go back there anytime and it'll be there for you to watch. Our next session is low. Our next session, low, has Jeet Thayil in conversation with Sampurna Chatterjee. Jeet Thayil talks about his new novel, Low, his forthcoming novels, Names of the Women, and will submit to an Ask Me Anything live interaction with the audience. Go for it, pick up that opportunity. Jeet Thayil worked as a journalist for 23 years in Bombay, Bangalore, Hong Kong, and New York. His first novel, Narcopolis, was awarded the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature and was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. His 5 poetry collections include These Errors Are Correct, which won the Sahitya Academy Award. And as a musician, his collaborations include the Noise Quintet, Still Dirty, the experimental trio HMT, and the opera Barber in London. Welcome on board, Jeet. Absolutely delighted to have you here.
Real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Sampurna Chatterjee is the author of 14 books, including the poetry book Apps and Muses, the children's book The Fried Frog, and other funny, freaky, foodie, feasty poems. The novels Rupture and The Land of the Well, as well as a collection of short stories about Mumbai titled Dirty Love. She is the editor of the anthology Sweeping the Front Yard, which brings together poetry and prose by women writing in English, Malayalam, Telugu, and Urdu. Her 2004 translation of Sukumar Ray's poetry and prose has been a Puffin classic since 2008. Her translation of the selected poems of Joy Goswami was shortlisted for the inaugural Khushwant Singh Memorial Prize for Poetry. Sampurna was the 2012 Charles Wallace Writer in Residence at the University of Kent, where she wrote her latest poetry book, Space Gulliver, Chronicles of an Alien. Please do ask questions, ladies and gentlemen, by typing it out in the comments section. You can also follow all our handles, JLF Litfest, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you wish to get notified, please do follow it. In case any of you get dropped off or there's a problem with the buffering on any of our handles, you can also go to YouTube and log on to JP, P for Parrot, R Litfest. So remember, JLF Litfest is the other handles across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. JPR Litfest is on YouTube. If you remember, I'd love you all to stay on at the end of this conversation, and we will take you through what is planned for tomorrow. But till then, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jeet Thayil and Sampurna Chatterjee.
Hello, and thank you so much, Sanjoy, for that warm and generous introduction. It's lovely to be back, albeit in this virtual, slightly disembodied platform. And Jeet, of course, it's an absolute pleasure to be talking to you again. It seems like yesterday when we were at JLF 2018 talking about chocolate saints, and right. So much has changed since then. And it's what hasn't changed is my anticipatory delight at the idea of being in conversation with you, even at the grimmest of times, perhaps especially in the grimmest of times. And so I thought, how else could we begin this conversation but by talking about the end of the world? Does that seem like a valuable proposition?
Absolutely.
And in Low, I was reading it last night, and it's funny how the lines that leap out, no matter when they were written or sent out into the world, invariably speak to the reader at the moment when the reader is engaging with those words. And so these lines, you knew the end of the world was coming and you took it in your stride, you had no choice, seemed somehow to address this situation that we find ourselves in. And I couldn't help but, notice these like magnetic fillings almost. There's that room full of people who've tanked out, and you write, it's as if an airborne virus had felled them where they stood. You have a doctor talking about how it's not about a battle with the virus, but a form of coexistence that's required. And it made me want to ask you two things. One, this alertness to omens, this natural predilection that a lot of writers, myself included, have for the catastrophe as an unfolding landscape for creative narratives, and especially, as you put it, in the age of the apocalypse. Why do you think so many writers, yourself included, seem to be instinctively drawn to this idea?
Thanks for that excellent question. I'd actually forgotten I'd forgotten the airborne virus that had fell them where they stood. But although I'm not surprised, I mean, now I remember, and I'm absolutely not surprised it was there. The end of the world is a kind of a constant subtext in Low. It's one of the 2 or 3 kind of themes that the novel keeps returning to, that the protagonist and the characters keep returning to. And I think it's difficult to be alive at this time. I mean, even before the world changed so definitively a couple of months ago, I think it was already difficult to be alive at this time without having a sense that we were at end times, that we were coming to a point at which life was going to change from the way we had always known it. That already our parents and grandparents' generations would find it difficult to recognize this planet that we have used and abused. And I think you don't have to be a writer. You just have to have your nose in the air to sense that we are at a cataclysmic moment in our lives and in the life of this planet. And so if you are aware of that, I mean, I don't know how you could write a novel set in 2020 that doesn't take that into account. And I think if you were to, or even a poem, any kind of creative work that doesn't have that kind of atmosphere and that sense of doom, and not entirely a hopeless noir sense, it doesn't have to be hopeless. I don't see how you could create something that doesn't have that somewhere in there.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think it's not just in this a moment of rupture and upheaval from which the desire for another kind of narrative emerges, right? For example, in Chocolate Saints, one of the key disruptive events was, of course, 9/11. In Low, it is the death of a loved one. And I think like you put it, it's not a question of choosing to write these narratives. Whether you speak to the moment, whether you see past the moment, or you're actually turning away from the moment, perhaps to raid other reserves of memory, nostalgia. Not nostalgia, the opposite of nostalgia. There was this phrase that, again, leapt out at me, where you make, this is your poet's ear, if you'll forgive me for saying that, where you say nostalgia, the word somehow is indicative of pain because it reminds you of neuralgia. And I was thinking of this, the attunement to the psychological registers of words, and how we can hear them through what you call the hum of disturbance. Is that what increasingly writers must do? Because, as you say, we live in the middle of these times. We cannot be separated from them. We are inundated, deluged. You even say doom is our only resource. And can there be a correct response to cataclysm?
And it reminds me, your question reminds me, there's also the phrase, I forget where it occurs, about being alert to augury and to fray. And I think that really is a kind of a job for the writer at the moment, which is to be alert to what's going on around us. And if you are alert, I mean, there's really no way to ignore climate change as something very real that's going on in our lives, and we see the result of it every day. It's impossible not to see the political situation in the world today, whether it's in India or the US or the UK. It's a kind of a swing to the right, but you get a feeling that it's the last swing to the right. After this, and it's all old men in their 70s who are the architects of that swing and who are the autocrats behind it. And you get the feeling that this is their last moment. And next, the generation that follows is going to turn everything that they've instituted upside down. And it's difficult not to read the news, for example, today and yesterday, that there's an asteroid the size of Jupiter headed towards Earth. For example, it's not just in the last couple of months or since January that we've been hearing the word pandemic. We've been actually hearing the word pandemic for years now, for at least 5 years now. It was 5 years ago that Obama, for example, talked about a pandemic that would come up and that would be impossible, that would devastate the planet. We've known that this is going to come. We've known that we are going to be in an age of pandemic. I think of it as the age of plague. This is the age that we are now stepping into, and it seems kind of correct that it's happening in the year 2020, because 2020 is also a description of perfect vision. It's seeing at 20 feet. And it makes sense that the year we stepped into the age of plague was the year that can also be thought of as seeing with clarity.
So, and I think it says a lot about how nothing happens in isolation. I mean, one of the metaphors that keep coming back, of course, are of the pestilence, the Black Death, the plague. I mean, especially for literary types, if I may say so. There is this sense of, we know this from our reading, we know this from the past. And at the same time, there is a new awareness of the way vocabularies change. And when I think of responses, and especially when I think of the way in which writers respond, things, whenever there's a seismic shift, as you say, there has been a seismic shift in the way the planet has to deal with the problems we've created. There's also going to be a shift in the way we use language, and therefore some of the new urgent vocabularies will start replacing the old vocabularies, saying things like going viral, or infectious enthusiasm, or even simply celebrating what Burroughs used to call the word virus, or what writers, we kind of thrive on the contagion of words, right? What happens to our relationship with these new versus old? For example, I'm thinking of the word lockdown, which has become already so normal. And, it makes me think, here is a word that I feel we've been preparing for. It's just a shade away from lock up. And it makes me think of it's almost as if the stage of besiegement is perhaps not as sudden as we think it to be. So what do you say to this? How do we as writers continue to raid the inarticulate, to say what is unspeakable in a way?
For the last month or so, I've really been unable to write because I just don't see the point of this in a moment like this. And I'm astonished at people who are already bringing out poems and books about the coronavirus. And, my instinct is to do absolutely nothing, to read, to listen to music, to just rest and gather my impressions and my senses. And then if there comes a time where writing seems valuable again, suppose I will do it, but at this moment I
Mm.
can't. And to go back to one of the phrases that you used, Burroughs' phrase, I think he said, language is a virus.
Yeah.
And it's,
Mm.
yeah, it is a virus. It is
Mm.
something that can kind of lodge inside you with all its
Mm.
suckers open, ready for
Mm.
contact, and then
Mm.
refuse to leave. But, that's I mean, it's coming from Burroughs. It's a kind of a romantic notion.
Mm.
And
Absolutely.
it's impossible now to read
No.
that phrase without
Yep.
kind of thinking of its
We.
limitations. Language
Yeah.
may be a virus, but who cares? At this point,
Yeah.
language seems
Yeah.
irrelevant. You know,
Yes. And I'm very glad you brought it up, this idea of being felled. There is a muteness that comes. And you've put it in low in very evocative words where you say, it's the curse of memory, it's the gift of forgetting. And while that in that particular novel is related to the specific scenario that is unfolding, it makes me think that this is a time in which we revisit, we reread. I just realized that Boccaccio wrote Decameron after he
yeah,
survived the Black Death. He
that's
survived
right.
it, and
Yeah.
then he was able to write that amazing piece of work that we cherish so many centuries later. But before I move on to talking about your new book, which I certainly would love to do, uh, the psychological fallout of this situation. A lot of it is circulating in social media, and so how do we cope with solitude, isolation, claustrophobia, all of that, silence? And it made me think, if these have often been touted as the essentials of, let's say, the ideal writerly life, chained to a chair, self imposed, self quarantine kind of situation, do you think that there has been that comforting fabric even to many of us in our hermetic worlds, if at all? It's impossible. There's been a tear, there's been a gash.
Yeah.
So, how do you feel? I guess you've said some of it already, because it's clearly a time of repair and record and witness. And is that how it feels for you? Because I feel the same. I feel absolutely unable to create.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's perfectly okay.
Mm.
It's okay to feel kind of overwhelmed, and it's okay to not work, and it's okay to unplug that engine that
Mm.
keeps telling us that we must produce every day. You don't have to produce every day. You don't
Mm.
have to do anything
Mm.
every day. And in
Mm.
fact, what this whole thing tells us, the
Mm.
kind of engine of commerce and consumerism and capitalism has been turned off.
Mm.
And we are
Yeah.
now at the mercy of ourselves, of our minds. And it's perfectly okay to allow that to take its own time before,
Mm.
if you begin to produce again. There's
Mm.
really
Mm.
no compulsion. And in fact, that's what it should tell us, that working, employment especially, is never gainful. You're always working for a
Mm.
boss whose basic deal is to give you money in exchange for your time, your life force, and your creative soul. In exchange for those things, you give it to them, they
Yeah.
lock it up in a cage for 8 hours a day, and in exchange for that, they give you money. How wonderful that that entire machine has come to a stop. I mean,
Mm.
it's,
And I think this transactional quality of our lives has been exposed, as it were. But quickly, before we open it up for questions, uh,
yeah,
on a happier note, your new book has just been acquired, um, and is going to be published in the Easter of 2021, I'm told. Tomorrow is Easter. So I have to ask you, Jeet, is this some miraculous coincidence, or is it just the result of meticulous planning? And would you say a little bit about this book, which has been, which your publisher calls a brave and feminist book in many ways? Would you tell our audience a little bit about names of the women?
sure. No, it's absolutely not meticulous planning. I wish I was capable of that kind of planning. I'm not. It just so happened that I was in kind of discussion about. I finished the book earlier this year, and I gave it to David Godwin, and he put it out there about a month or so ago, and it was picked up uh, exactly a month ago. And because there's usually a year of a lead time, the publisher decided that it would appear around this time next year, which is around Easter next year. And of course, that seems absolutely correct that a book about Christ.
I love it.
Yeah.
Yes, I love it. And there's a Caravaggio on the wall behind me. So, there is a question that has come in, which I'll come to in a minute.
Yeah.
Is he trying to do that? What exactly is the emotion behind the new book? Is he just trying to paint a picture for the audience? Before we come there, just to stay with names of the women for a bit.
Yeah.
This is a question I've always wanted to ask you, and since you've said ask me anything, this link between, say, Chocolate Saints, where you reclaim the iconography of the blonde, blue-eyed saints and put the chocolate saint in the center, create a new picture for us to look at. And in this one, it's the stories from the marginalized, or the women who don't have a voice in the New Testament. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship to this faith that you were born into? What is the attraction, for example, of the New Testament, which made you want to retell it in this way?
I've been reading the New and the Old Testaments my whole life, not only because I'm a Syrian Christian, but because around the age of 14, when I began to read poetry seriously, when I began to read The Flowers of Evil, Charles Baudelaire's, some translations of Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil, I also began to read the Bible, specifically the book of Job and the Song of Solomon, and those books where you got a sense of the poetry of the Bible. And I read it as really like a kind of a literary text. But also in my family, my grandmother, for example, used to conduct the service in our house in Kerala if she wasn't able to go to church, and she would read the entire Bible for 2 hours, in fact, recite it from memory. And so for me, those stories were kind of a living texts. They were not just stories in a book. They were stories that were around me, that swirled around me. And I continued to read it. But it wasn't until last year that I looked at it with a sense of trying to see the pieces that are missing from the puzzle of that is the Bible. And the reason for that is a lot of the 4 Gospels that we know as the New Testament were all written by men. And if you notice the way women appear in those Gospels, they may turn up to do, in fact, something crucial in a scene. For example, the scene where a woman holds onto Christ's robe, and he's surrounded by a mob of people, a crowd of people pressing into him. But somebody sick, a woman who is ill, holds his robe, hoping that by grabbing his robe, her illness will be cured. And he stops and says, "Who touched me?" And one of his disciples, and the disciples, the 12 men, they're really the most feckless bunch of layabouts you can possibly imagine. They do absolutely nothing. They were the first to abandon him. When he was crucified, they were nowhere in the picture because they were basically cowards and they ran for their life. One of those disciples said, "But how can you ask who touched you? Look at all the people who are touching you." And he says, "No, but somebody touched me for a reason." And then the woman says, "It was I." And then there's the whole dialogue. But the woman is never named. You never know anything about her. You don't know who she is. You don't know where she came from. You don't know her illness. You just know about this part of the story. So I thought it would be instructive for me, at least, to fill in those blanks and to tell her story, her backstory, to give a version of what possibly might have led her there and why she was so desperate that she thought that simply by grabbing his robe, it might help cure her illness. And so that's one of the characters.
I think that's yeah. I can't wait to read it, and I'm told there are only 5 more minutes, unfortunately. So I would like to get one of the questions, which is from Kajuli, who asks, intrigued by the pink mattress in the background, does it have some particular significance? And then there's another question which I'll come to if we have time.
Yeah, of course.
It's
not a mattress, by the way.
That I'm sure you've always wanted to answer.
Yeah, it's a pink bedspread, a blanket actually. It's not a mattress, it's a blanket. And of course it has a significance. It's got everything to do with the retelling of the New Testament.
Lovely, I love that answer. There's a question from Adi.
From the point of view of women. That's why it's pink.
Yeah, pink. Oh gosh, no. Goes a stereotype. There's a question from Adi. Do you want to be happy, or do you want to write? Is writing always that process that you do to pull yourself out of grief, or is it possible to write good poetry in times of great happiness?
I don't know if you're quoting this line back at me. I'm pretty sure I once wrote a poem many, many years ago with the line, do you want to be happy or do you want to write?
Yeah, it was in quotation marks in the...
Okay, well done. I'm glad somebody's done their homework.
The question. So you have a reader who knows your work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. I think in my case, I think I might have answered that question with my life so far, and it certainly has been that I would rather write than be happy. I think happiness is overrated. I think happiness is a kind of a myth that's been that we've been force-fed with. For one thing, it doesn't last very long, and for another, I don't think it leads to any kind of sustained satisfaction, which writing can give you. Certainly a piece of writing into which you put something that matters to you, where something at stake is dealt with. I think when you're engaged in that kind of work, I think the kind of, I wouldn't use the word happiness, joy might be a better word, or a kind of satisfaction might be a better word. I think that lasts much longer than the mythological happiness that we've been told about since we were children.
Thank you so much, Jeet. I believe we are out of time, and I think we've ended miraculously on just the right note.
Happiness.
You say, yeah, happiness, and also there's this, everything is undercut with hope somehow in the book that I've just emerged from. And you write, anything was possible at the end of days. And you ask the question, how do we get through the next catastrophe? Perhaps by writing, by reading, by reaching out to each other, by thinking, and by pausing. Thank you, Jeet, for being one of those people who writes books that will see us through. And
thank you, Sampurna, for the same thing, for writing books that will see us through.
Thank you so much, Jeet. Thank you so much, Sampurna. Jeet, maybe the answer to that question was you're part of the indigo generation in that beautiful pink and purple space that you have, and you're intuitive, you're connected to many different worlds that exist around us, and more strength and power to both of you in your writing to help us overcome and make sense perhaps of the times that we are in. And hopefully, as Jeet said, looking into the future, we press the reset button, we look differently at nature, we respect everything around us, But truly, thank you very much, both of you.
Thank
Thank
you
you
for
guys
joining.
for
Thank
joining
you.
us. And
Thank you, Shanjoy.
please tune in tomorrow, Sunday, the 12th of April, to view Footprints Tracking the Plight of Migrant Workers. We have Chinmay Tumbe, author of India Moving, A History of Migration, and journalist and author Saban Naqvi join us to track the plight of migrant communities following the national lockdown and discuss the disruption to labor markets and livelihoods. Following that, we have The Boundary, no less than Jhumpa Lahiri, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and one of the Indian diaspora's best known writers, who talks to polylingual literature in a time of pandemics with Chiki Sarkar. And that, again, is tomorrow. That's at 9 p.m. Indian Standard Time. The previous one is at 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Times, which is British Standard Time at 3 p.m. and Eastern Summertime, which is at 10 a.m. For those of you who wish to stay on, logged on because you want more, and those of you who missed the music from the previous episode, we're bringing back for you Anhad Naad, sounds from the Sikhs and Sufis, presented by the incredible Amrit Kaur Lohia on vocals, who performed at Glastonbury, accompanied by her brother, Pratap Singh Lohia. And that will be immediately after this program. Meanwhile, stay safe. Remember, whichever part of the world you're in, if you're going to go out, try not to, but if you are, wear your thing, stay safe, stay healthy, use the time, reboot, spread the love. Yes, it's difficult in confined spaces, but hey, healthy once. Thank you all so much. And now over to Anha or Loya.
राग बिहागड़ा महला पंजवा अत प्रीतम मन मोहना कटे सोहना कटे सोहना प्राण धारा राम अत प्रीतम मन मोहना कटे सोहना प्राण धारा राम सुंदर सोबा लाल गोपाल सुंदर सोबा लाल गोपाल दयाल की अपर राम अपरे पारा राम लाल गोपाल